Blood tastes like old pennies and regret. Dean didn't plan to die on a wet Tuesday outside a dirty convenience store, shielding a crying kid he didn't even know. 4 bullets shredded his chest, tearing through the cheap, damp cotton of his thrift store jacket. As his vision blurred into static, a shadow eclipsed the streetlights. Heavy boots, the suffocating scent of dark cedar, and a massive hand gripping his jaw. "Mine," a voice growled, teeth sinking violently into his bleeding neck. Neon buzzed overhead with a sound like a dying wasp. Dean leaned against the brick alleyway wall, letting the cold drizzle soak into the shoulders of his uniform. The air smelled of wet asphalt, rotting cabbage from the dumpster, and the sharp chemical tang of the off-brand heat suppressants dissolving in his bloodstream. His head pounded. It always pounded on Tuesdays, the day after he took the heavy-duty pills he bought from a guy named Mickey behind the laundromat. They were terrible for his liver, but they kept his scent dull and flat, like wet cardboard. Nobody looked twice at an Omega who smelled like wet cardboard. He took a drag from a cigarette he didn't even want. The smoke burned his throat, a harsh reminder that he was alive and $30 short on rent. Across the street, a black town car idled. Dean had noticed it 10 minutes ago while taking out the trash. It didn't belong in this neighborhood. This was a place where hubcaps went missing and stray dogs fought over chicken bones. The car was pristine, absorbing the sickly yellow glow of the street lamps. A small boy, maybe 6 years old, skipped out of the corner bakery holding a paper bag. He wore a bright yellow raincoat and a backpack with green dinosaur spikes running down the center. He was entirely too bright for this gray street. Dean exhaled a plume of gray smoke, watching the kid with mild, detached exhaustion. "Where are your parents, kid?" He didn't have time to finish the thought. The pop-pop-pop sound didn't register as gunfire at first. It sounded thin, papery, like a string of cheap firecrackers going off in a coffee can. But then the front window of the bakery shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds raining down onto the wet sidewalk. Dean froze. His brain, sluggish from the suppressants and a double shift at the diner, struggled to process the geometry of the violence. A silver sedan had pulled up parallel to the Blacktown car. Windows down, metal pipes sticking out. The kid in the yellow raincoat stopped dead in the middle of the crosswalk. He dropped his paper bag. 2 perfect powdered cannolis spilled onto the dirty street. The boy just stood there, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream, caught perfectly between the shooters and their target. Dean didn't think. If he had thought about it, he would have stayed in the alley. He was cynical, deeply tired, and fiercely protective of his own miserable life. He owed nothing to anyone, but his body moved before his brain could catch up, driven by some raw, stupid, deeply buried instinct. He dropped the cigarette and launched himself across the slick pavement. "Hey!" Dean roared, though his voice was swallowed entirely by the screech of tires and the deafening crack of automatic fire. He hit the kid hard, tackling the small body down onto the cold, unforgiving asphalt. Dean wrapped himself around the yellow raincoat, curling his spine outward to form a human shell. The first bullet felt like a baseball bat swung by a professional hitter straight into his ribs. The sheer kinetic force of it punched the breath from his lungs in a sharp, wet gasp. The second and third tore through his right shoulder and upper back in quick, agonizing succession. It didn't burn. Not yet. It felt icy, like somebody had driven freezing steel rods through his muscles and snapped them off inside. The fourth bullet clipped his side, tearing through flesh and grazing a rib. Dean collapsed entirely, his chin cracking against the pavement. His vision fractured into a kaleidoscope of gray and black. Beneath him, the small boy was thrashing, crying out in a high, terrified pitch that made Dean's ringing ears ache. "Stay down," Dean tried to say, but his mouth only filled with a thick, hot, metallic taste. He coughed, and a spray of crimson painted the concrete inches from his nose. The silver sedan's tires squealed as it tore off down the street, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavier than the gunfire. Dean lay there, staring at a discarded cannoli slowly absorbing the muddy rain. He couldn't feel his legs. His chest felt tight. incredibly tight, as if someone had parked a truck on his sternum. Every ragged breath was a negotiation with agony. Well, Dean thought, the edges of his consciousness fraying into dark threads. At least I don't have to pay rent on Friday. He closed his eyes, waiting for the dark to pull him under. He expected it to be quiet. He wanted it to be quiet. Instead, the air abruptly shattered. Heavy doors slammed. Boots pounded against the pavement, vibrating through the concrete straight into Dean's cheek. Voices barked in sharp, frantic Italian. But it wasn't the noise that pulled Dean back from the brink of passing out. It was the smell. It hit him like a physical blow. A scent so dense, so aggressively dominant, that it cut straight through the smog, the copper stench of his own blood, and the chemical haze of his suppressants. Crushed pine needles, charred wood, and underneath it, a dark, terrifying musk that screamed alpha. It wasn't a romantic scent. It didn't make Dean's heart flutter. It made his biology panic. It was the scent of an apex predator stepping into a blood-soaked arena. It was suffocating, pressing him further into the dirt, demanding absolute submission from a body that was already dying. "Leo!" a voice roared. It was a terrifying sound. A baritone scraped raw with panic and rage. Hands grabbed Dean, not gently. Massive, unyielding hands gripped his shoulders and hauled him off the boy. Dean let out a gargled, wet scream as the movement ground shattered bone against shattered bone. He was tossed onto his back. Rain fell into his open, unfocused eyes. "Papa!" the boy wailed, scrambling up. "Papa, he fell on me! There was loud noises, and he fell!" A man knelt beside Dean, the alpha, the source of the crushing pheromones. Dean's vision swam, but he could make out broad shoulders wrapped in an expensive dark wool coat and a face carved from granite. Sharp jaw, a nose that had been broken and set perfectly, and eyes as dark and unforgiving as a starless night. The alpha's hands moved over his son frantically, checking for blood. "Are you hit? Leo, look at me. Are you hit?" "No," the kid sobbed, burying his face in the man's neck. "The man pushed me." The alpha's head snapped down. His dark eyes locked onto Dean. Dean was drowning in his own blood. His breathing was a wet, rattling sound that terrified him. He looked up at the man, his vision darkening at the edges. His chipped, dirty fingernails scraped against the asphalt, trying to find purchase, trying to drag himself away from the terrifying gravity of this alpha. "He's going to kill me for touching his kid," Dean's cynical brain supplied. "I ruined his suit." The alpha handed the boy off to a man in a dark suit who had run up behind them. "Get him in the car. Now." The man turned his full, terrifying attention onto Dean. He leaned in close. The scent of pine and smoke was a physical weight on Dean's chest, making it impossible to draw what little air he could manage. The alpha's eyes flicked over the 4 bleeding holes in Dean's torso. He saw the cheap, stained uniform. He saw the pale, sweaty skin, the dilated pupils, and then his gaze locked onto the side of Dean's neck, to the unbonded scent gland hidden beneath a layer of grime. Something primal, dark, and utterly unhinged fractured the alpha's stoic expression. The pupils of his eyes blew wide, swallowing the irises entirely until they were pools of pitch black. He didn't call for an ambulance. He didn't offer a word of thanks. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand gripping Dean's jaw with bruising force, tilting the Omega's head to the side to expose his throat. Dean tried to thrash, tried to push the man away, but his arms were utterly useless. A whimper tore from his throat. "No, no, what are you doing?" "Mine!" the alpha snarled, a sound that vibrated deep in his chest. Before Dean could comprehend the violation, the alpha lunged. Teeth tore into the delicate skin over Dean's scent gland. It wasn't a nip. It wasn't a kiss. It was a brutal, violent tearing of flesh. The pain was blinding, a white-hot flare that eclipsed even the agony of the bullet wounds. Dean's spine arched completely off the pavement, a raw, broken scream tearing from his lungs. He felt the heavy, thick venom of the alpha flood into his bloodstream. It hit his system like a freight train, clashing violently with the cheap suppressants still in his veins. His body seized. The venom was molten lead, burning through his arteries, forcing a biological reboot. It demanded his heart keep beating. It demanded his lungs keep pulling air. It forced his dying cells into a frantic, hyper-driven state of survival, anchored entirely to the monster currently drinking his blood. The alpha pulled back, his mouth smeared with crimson. His breathing was ragged, his chest heaving as he stared down at the permanent, jagged mark he had just carved into Dean's life. Dean stared back, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes, mixing with the rain. His body felt hot, feverish, and utterly tethered to the man above him. The cynical, independent core of his identity shrieked in horror. He was bound, claimed on a filthy sidewalk by a stranger. "You're not dying tonight," the alpha whispered, his voice dark and absolute. He slipped his arms under Dean's knees and shoulders, lifting him from the puddle of his own blood. "You belong to me now." The pain and the biological overload finally peaked. Dean's eyes rolled back, and he surrendered to the crushing dark. The first thing Dean noticed was the texture of the sheets. They were wrong. They were cool, frictionless, and heavy, high thread count cotton, maybe even silk. He expected the scratchy, pill-covered polyester of a county hospital, or the damp fleece of his own cheap mattress. The second thing he noticed was the smell. Iodine, rubbing alcohol, and dark cedar, crushed pine. Dean's eyes snapped open. A sharp, agonizing pull in his chest immediately punished him for the sudden movement. He gasped a dry, reedy sound, and squeezed his eyes shut until the black spots faded. He took stock of his body piece by miserable piece. IV drip in his left hand. A dull, heavy numbness in his right shoulder. A tight, restrictive banding wrapped entirely around his ribcage. Every time he inhaled, it felt like cracked glass grinding together inside his lungs. He was alive. The realization came with a heavy dose of resentment. But worst of all was his neck. It throbbed, a deep pulsing ache that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. It felt heavy, hot, and sensitive to even the slight breeze from the air conditioning vent above. Memories slammed into him with the force of a car crash. The rain, the kid, the bullets, the asphalt, the teeth. Dean's left hand flew to his neck, his fingers brushing against thick gauze. A jolt of electricity shot down his spine, making him flinch. The bond. It was there. It hummed in his blood, a foreign, intrusive frequency that made his stomach churn with nausea and something deeply, humiliatingly biological. "Don't touch it!" The voice came from the corner of the room. It was calm, deep, and carried the effortless authority of a man who rarely had to repeat himself. Dean slowly turned his head. The room was massive, bathed in the dim light of a sleek, modern floor lamp. It looked like a high-end hotel suite, except for the array of medical monitors clustered by the bed. Sitting in a leather armchair in the shadows was the alpha. He was out of his wet wool coat, wearing a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faded ink. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, swirling it slowly. He looked rested, pristine. Dean felt dirty just looking at him, despite knowing he had been scrubbed clean. Dean started, but his voice cracked, sounding like dry leaves. He swallowed hard. "Where am I?" "My home," the man said. He set the glass down and stood up. As he walked toward the bed, the sheer gravity of his presence pressed down on Dean. The bond, the raw, freshly torn connection in Dean's neck, flared to life. Dean's pulse automatically synchronized with the alpha's approaching footsteps. His body wanted to preen, to submit, to bare his throat and seek comfort from the alpha who had marked him. Dean hated it. He hated his own biology in that moment more than he had ever hated anything in his life. He gritted his teeth, forcing his chin down, refusing to look up. "You're in a secure medical wing," The Alpha continued, stopping at the foot of the bed. My personal physician extracted 4 bullets from you. You have 2 broken ribs, a shattered scapula, and massive blood loss. You've been unconscious for 3 days. 3 days? Dean's mind spun. I need to go back. My job. My apartment. You don't have a job anymore, the man stated smoothly. And your lease has been terminated. Your belongings, what little there was, have been moved here. Dean stared at him, anger finally piercing through the fog of painkillers and biological submission. Excuse me? Who the hell do you think you are? The Alpha tilted his head, his dark eyes unreadable. My name is Victor Carmine. The boy you threw yourself over is my son, Leo. Carmine. Dean wasn't an idiot. He read the papers. The Carmine family owned half the shipping ports in the city and ran the underground of the other half. He had just taken 4 bullets for a Mafia prince. I didn't ask you to move my stuff, Dean snapped, wincing as the anger made his chest pull. And I sure as hell didn't ask you to bite me. Victor's expression hardened. The scent of cedar spiked, turning sharp and dominant, filling the room until Dean felt like he was suffocating. Victor stepped around the bed, leaning over Dean. He braced one large hand on the mattress near Dean's hip, trapping him in place. You were dying, Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. Your heart stopped twice in the car. The suppressants in your system thinned your blood to water. The only reason your body fought to stay alive was because I forced a bond into your system. The venom stabilized you. You made me a pet, Dean spat, refusing to back down even as his hands trembled. You violated me. I didn't consent to a bond. I would have rather died on that sidewalk. Liar, Victor whispered. He reached out, his thumb lightly brushing the edge of the gauze on Dean's neck. Dean shuddered, a traitorous involuntary whine catching in his throat. He hated the sound. He hated the way his eyes fluttered at the touch. You don't want to die, Victor continued, his gaze dropping to Dean's lips before rising back to his eyes. You jumped in front of my son because you have instincts you pretend not to possess. You are fiercely protective. And now, you are mine. You saved my blood. I saved yours. We are tied. I'm not part of your world, Dean said, turning his face away, staring at the blank wall. The monitors beeped steadily, betraying the calm he was trying to project. You are now, Victor said, straightening up. He adjusted his cuffs, his demeanor shifting back to cold professionalism. Rest, Omega. When you are healed, we will discuss your duties in this household. I'm not a maid. I didn't say you were, Victor replied, walking toward the heavy oak door. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. The harsh light caught the sharp angles of his face. Why, Leo has been asking for you. He wants to see the man who saved him. Dean swallowed the lump in his throat. He remembered the boy's terrified face, the yellow raincoat, the spilled cannolis. Is he okay? He asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. A flicker of something genuine, relief perhaps, or respect, passed through Victor's dark eyes. He's unharmed, because of you. Victor opened the door. Get some sleep, Dean. Non. The door clicked shut, leaving Dean alone in the sterile silence. He stared up at the ceiling, feeling the heavy, undeniable throb of the bite on his neck. He was alive. But as the scent of cedar lingered heavily in the room, sinking into his skin and his senses, Dean realized with a sinking dread that his life was entirely, irreversibly over. Sunlight felt offensive. It poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the recovery suite, a harsh, unforgiving glare that highlighted every speck of dust dancing in the air. Dean hated it. He spent his entire adult life navigating the neon-lit gloom of third-shift diners and damp basement apartments. This sheer, unadulterated brightness made him feel exposed, like a bug pinned to a corkboard. 4 weeks had passed since the shooting. The shattered scapula was knitting together, held by titanium screws he could practically feel clicking when it rained. The two broken ribs were a constant dull ache that spiked into white-hot agony whenever he sneezed. He was walking now, though it was a pathetic, shuffling gait. He stood by the window, wearing a pair of dark gray sweatpants and a soft cotton t-shirt that belonged to Victor. He hadn't wanted to wear the Alpha's clothes. He had explicitly asked the silent, terrifyingly efficient nurse for his own things. She had simply folded Victor's shirt and placed it on the bed with a sympathetic, pitying smile. The scent of dark cedar and crushed pine was woven into the very fabric. His traitorous, newly bonded Omega biology practically purred every time the cotton brushed his skin. Dean wanted to set the shirt on fire. He leaned his forehead against the cool glass, looking down at the sprawling, manicured estate. High stone walls, iron gates, men in dark suits walking the perimeter with the distinct, heavy bulge of shoulder holsters under their jackets. It was a prison, a beautiful, terrifyingly expensive prison. A soft, hesitant knock broke the quiet hum of the air conditioner. Dean turned, wincing as his ribs protested. The heavy oak door pushed open just a crack. A small face peered in, framed by messy dark curls. "Hey!" a tiny voice squeaked. It was Leo. He wasn't wearing the yellow raincoat today. Just a pair of denim overalls and a striped shirt. He clutched the green dinosaur backpack to his chest like a shield. Dean's cynical armor cracked just a fraction. He didn't like kids. Kids were loud, sticky, and asked too many questions. But looking at the boy whose life had cost him his freedom, Dean felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with bullets. "Hey, kid," Dean rasped. His throat was still permanently dry from the medications. "You lost?" Leo pushed the door open entirely and shuffled into the room. He kept his eyes on his light-up sneakers. The smell of the boy hit Dean, sweet milk, honey, and the faint lingering undertone of Victor's cedar scent, the pup of his Alpha. The bond in Dean's neck flared warmly, an involuntary biological urge to nest, to protect. Dean swallowed hard, forcing the feeling down into the darkest pit of his stomach. "Papa said you were awake," Leo mumbled, stopping a few feet away. He looked up, his big dark eyes, so much like his father's, yet entirely innocent, landing on Dean. "He said you got hurt cause of me." "Your dad talks too much," Dean said, leaning back against the windowsill and crossing his arms carefully over his chest. "I didn't get hurt because of you. I got hurt because some idiots don't know how to aim." Leo blinked, processing the rough, unpolished way Dean spoke. Everyone else in this house spoke in hushed, reverent tones. "I brought you something," Leo said. He unzipped the dinosaur backpack. The zipper snagged, and the boy fought with it, his lower lip jutting out in frustration. Dean watched him struggle. He should help. The bond screamed at him to help the pup. Instead, Dean stayed put, letting the kid figure it out. He wasn't a nanny. Finally, the zipper gave way. Leo pulled out a crumpled, slightly sticky piece of construction paper and held it out with both hands. Dean pushed off the windowsill and shuffled forward. He took the paper. It was a crayon drawing, a stick figure with yellow scribbles for a raincoat, and a much larger stick figure standing in front of it, covered in aggressive red marker dots. Above them, a massive, blocky black car. "It's you!" Leo pointed to the red-dotted figure. "You're bleeding, but you're very brave. Like a superhero. Like Batman, but with no cape." Dean stared at the crude drawing. The sheer, blunt honesty of a child detailing the worst trauma of Dean's life was jarring. He ran a thumb over the waxy red crayon marks. His chest tightened. It wasn't the ribs. "Batman's rich," Dean murmured, his voice sounding entirely too thick. "I just smell like old grease." "You smell like Papa," Leo corrected him, tilting his head. "You smell safe." Dean's breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a second, the words twisting the knife of his reality. He didn't smell like himself anymore. He smelled like Victor Carmine's property. Before Dean could formulate a sarcastic response to deflect the heavy emotion, the atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The air grew dense, heavy with the sharp, crackling scent of ozone and pine. Victor stood in the doorway. He wore a dark tailored suit, a silver tie clip catching the light. His eyes locked onto Dean, dark and possessive, before sliding down to his son. "Leo," Victor said, his baritone voice smooth but commanding. "I told you to let him rest." "I gave him my picture," Leo said, turning to his father. "He liked it." Victor stepped into the room. The sheer mass of him seemed to shrink the spacious suite. "That's so?" He looked at Dean, one eyebrow raised in a silent challenge. "It's going on the fridge," Dean said dryly, waving the paper. "Right next to my hostage demands." Victor's jaw tightened, a fleeting look of annoyance crossing his features. "Take your backpack, Leo. Maria's waiting in the kitchen with a snack." Leo grabbed his bag, gave Dean a small, shy wave, and darted past his father out the door. Victor closed the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded like a vault ceiling shut. He walked slowly toward Dean, his eyes trailing over the oversized t-shirt, noting how it hung off Dean's thin, bruised frame. "You shouldn't be standing this long," Victor said. It wasn't a suggestion. "I'm fine, and I'm going crazy staring at that wall," Dean shot back, refusing to break eye contact. He hated the way his pulse picked up. He hated the way the bite mark on his neck throbbed in rhythm with Victor's approaching steps. "You are healing," Victor corrected smoothly. He stopped just inches away. Dean had to tilt his head back to look at him. The proximity was intoxicating and terrifying. "The doctor says you're strong enough to leave this wing tomorrow." Dean's eyes narrowed. "Leave the wing and go where? Out the front gate?" Victor stepped closer, his chest brushing against Dean's folded arms. The heat radiating off the Alpha was immense. "No, into the main house, with me." The dining room was a masterclass in aggressive wealth. A massive mahogany table stretched the length of the room, polished to a mirror finish. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling, casting fractured prismatic light over the expensive silverware. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, seared meat, and the heavy competing pheromones of 4 dominant alphas. Dean sat near the head of the table, entirely out of his depth and aggressively resentful of it. He was wearing his own clothes. Finally. A faded black band t-shirt and a pair of dark jeans that were now dangerously loose around his waist. He looked like a stray dog that had wandered into a purebred dog show. He felt like one too. Victor sat at the head of the table, nursing a glass of dark red wine. To his right sat 3 men. Dean didn't know their names, only their faces from the files of old newspaper clippings he used to read in the diner. They were Victor's inner circle, capos, enforcers, killers, and they were staring at Dean. So, the man closest to Dean, a heavily scarred alpha with a broken nose and a cheap cologne that smelled like pepper, spoke up. He sawed into his steak, his eyes fixed on Dean's throat, specifically the thick white medical patch covering the bite mark. "This is the stray that took the hit for the kid." Dean gripped his fork. The heavy silver handle felt cold and unfamiliar. He didn't say anything. He just stared at his plate of perfectly plated risotto. He was starving, but his stomach was tied in tight, anxious knots. "Quiet one," the man chuckled, taking a bite of meat. "Surprised you claimed him, boss. He's skinny, smells sour underneath your scent. Must have been a street rat." Silence fell over the table. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the sharp, sudden vacuum of air that precedes a bomb going off. Dean felt a flash of pure, reckless anger. He was tired of being treated like an object, like a broken toy Victor had picked up off the pavement. He dropped his fork onto his plate. The clatter echoed loudly in the quiet room. "I smell sour," Dean said, his voice raspy but steady. "Because I've been sweating out cheap black market heat suppressants for a month so predators like you wouldn't look twice at me on the subway." The scarred man stopped chewing. His eyes darkened. "And I'm skinny," Dean continued, leaning back in his chair, matching the alpha's glare with his own exhausted defiance. "Because I worked 80 hours a week scrubbing grease off griddles just to afford those pills. So excuse me if I don't meet your standard for a mobster's trophy wife." The man dropped his knife. He started to stand, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "You mouthy little—" "Sit down, Paulie." Victor hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't even looked up from his wine glass. But the sheer, suffocating weight of his command slammed into the room. The air pressure dropped. The scent of dark cedar spiked so sharply it smelled like burning wood. Paulie froze halfway out of his chair. He swallowed hard, the aggression bleeding out of him instantly. He slowly sank back down, keeping his eyes firmly on the tablecloth. Victor finally looked up. His dark eyes bypassed his men entirely and locked onto Dean. There was no anger in his gaze. Instead, there was a dark, terrifyingly intense possessiveness that made the hair on Dean's arms stand up. "He is not a stray," Victor said, his voice cold and smooth as polished stone. "He bled on the asphalt for my son while the rest of you were half a block away. He has more courage in his shattered ribs than any man at this table." Victor set his glass down. He didn't break eye contact with Dean. "And he is mine," Victor added, the words vibrating with a heavy primal resonance. "Disrespect him again, and you will lose the tongue you used to do it." Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed too loudly. Dean stared back at Victor. He should have felt vindicated. He should have felt protected. But all he felt was a deep, terrifying realization. Victor wasn't defending a guest. He was defending his territory, and Dean was the territory. Victor reached out, his large hand wrapping around Dean's wrist beneath the table. The touch was scorching. His thumb pressed firmly against Dean's pulse point. The bond sang, a humiliating chorus of safety and submission that washed through Dean's veins. "Eat your dinner, Dean," Victor murmured softly, a stark contrast to the death threat he had just issued. Dean looked down at his risotto. His hand was trembling slightly. He picked up his fork, his throat tight. He was safe from the wolves at the table, but he was entirely at the mercy of the monster at the head of it. The crash didn't happen all at once. It snuck up on him, insidious and slow, like damp rot in the walls. It started with a tremor in his hands, a slight shake when he tried to pour a glass of water. Then came the cold sweats. He would wake up in his new massive bedroom, the one adjoining Victor's, soaking through the expensive silk sheets, his teeth chattering uncontrollably despite the heavy duvet. By the third day after dinner, Dean couldn't stand up. He was curled into a tight, miserable ball on the bathroom floor. The cool marble tiles offered the only relief against the fiery heat baking his skin. The cheap, toxic suppressants he had been taking for years were finally fully out of his system, and his body was in absolute chaotic revolt. It wasn't a heat, it was a withdrawal, and it was agonizing. His bones ached with a deep, grinding pain. His stomach heaved, empty and cramped. Every nerve ending felt raw, exposed to the air. The smell of his own sweat was pungent, a sour, metallic tang mixed with the sudden, overwhelming bloom of his natural omega scent, which had been buried for a decade. It smelled like crushed blackberries and rain, but it was currently tainted with the acrid stench of sickness. He clutched his knees to his chest, gasping for air. The bathroom lights were off, but even the sliver of daylight creeping under the door felt like needles in his eyes. "Dean." The heavy bathroom door opened. The ambient light from the bedroom flooded in, making Dean squeeze his eyes shut and let out a pathetic, ragged groan. Heavy footsteps crossed the tiles. The scent of pine and smoke hit him, thick and overwhelming. Before, the scent had made him feel trapped. Right now, to his fever-addled, biologically frantic brain, it smelled like an anchor. It smelled like the only thing keeping him from floating away into the pain. Victor dropped to his knees beside him. He didn't care about his expensive suit pants on the damp floor. "Why didn't you press the call button?" Victor's voice was rough, edged with panic. "Go away," Dean managed to choke out. though his body betrayed him by leaning slightly toward the Alpha's heat. "You're burning up," Victor said, ignoring the protest. He stripped off his suit jacket, tossing it aside. He reached out, his massive hands gently uncurling Dean from his tight ball. Dean whined, a high, broken sound that humiliated him even through the haze of the fever. His muscles cramped violently as Victor pulled him upward. "The suppressants," Victor muttered, lifting Dean entirely off the floor. He cradled the Omega against his chest, careful of the healing shoulder. "The doctor warned me the cellular detox would be severe." "It hurts," Dean gasped, burying his face into the crook of Victor's neck. He couldn't help it. The proximity to the Alpha's scent gland was a narcotic. He inhaled deeply, the rich cedar scent acting like a balm against the jagged edges of his panic. Victor carried him out of the bathroom and laid him gently on the center of the massive bed. "I'm calling the doctor. He can give you something for the pain," Victor said, turning toward the bedside table. "No!" Dean panicked, his hand shooting out to grab Victor's wrist. His grip was weak, his fingers trembling violently. "No more pills. Please, I can't put more garbage in my blood." Victor stopped. He looked down at Dean's desperate, sweat-slicked face. The Alpha's jaw clenched. He looked entirely out of his element. This wasn't a bullet wound he could stitch up. This wasn't an enemy he could shoot. "Your body is trying to regulate a decade of suppressed hormones in a matter of hours," Victor said softly, kneeling by the edge of the bed. "Your nervous system is misfiring." Just stay," Dean whispered, the words pulled from him by the absolute desperate demand of the bond. He hated himself for asking. He hated the vulnerability. But the moment Victor had pulled slightly away, the cold and the pain had doubled in intensity. Victor's eyes softened, a dark, profound understanding settling over his sharp features. He didn't hesitate. He kicked off his shoes and climbed onto the mattress. He didn't pull the heavy duvet over them. Instead, he pulled Dean against him, skin to skin. Dean let out a shuddering breath as his back was pressed flush against Victor's broad, solid chest. Victor wrapped his arms around him, careful not to squeeze the healing ribs, but holding him tight enough to cage the violent tremors racking Dean's frame. Victor buried his face in Dean's damp hair. He deliberately released a heavy, steady wave of calming alpha pheromones. It washed over Dean like a warm, heavy blanket. The frantic, painful misfiring in Dean's nerves began to slow, synchronized to the slow, deep rhythm of Victor's heartbeat against his spine. "I've got you," Victor murmured, his deep voice rumbling against Dean's shoulder blades. "Let it out. I've got you." Dean closed his eyes, tears of sheer exhaustion leaking out and soaking into the pillow. He was a cynic. He was a survivor who had trusted no one for 10 years. But lying here, held together by the monster who had claimed him on the sidewalk, Dean realized the most terrifying truth of all. He didn't want to fight it anymore. For the first time in his life, he let himself just be held. Recovery was not a straight line. It was a jagged, frustrating spiral. By week 6, the deep, rattling cough had faded, leaving behind only the dull ache of knitting ribs. The withdrawal from the suppressants had finally broken like a fever, leaving Dean's biology radically altered, or, more accurately, restored. He had spent a decade burying his nature under layers of cheap chemicals, terrified of the vulnerability that came with being an Omega in a city that preyed on them. Now he couldn't hide. His scent had bloomed, rich and undeniable. It no longer smelled like wet cardboard. It smelled like crushed blackberries and rain, sharp, slightly sweet, and utterly distinct. He hated it. It felt like walking around naked. But worst of all was how it interacted with Victor. Whenever the Alpha was in the room, Dean's blackberry scent would unconsciously sweeten, reaching out to tangle with the heavy dark cedar that permanently coated the master suite. It was a biological betrayal of the highest order. To escape the suffocating luxury of the main house, Dean had found sanctuary in the estate's sprawling glass greenhouse. It was located behind the west wing, a massive, humid structure filled with overgrown ferns, climbing ivy, and rows of meticulously cultivated nightshades. It smelled like damp earth and fertilizer, a grounding, dirty scent that reminded Dean of the real world. He sat on a wooden potting bench, his knees pulled up to his chest, carefully running a damp rag over the broad, waxy leaves of a monstrous monstera plant. He wore a pair of worn-out denim jeans and a gray Henley. The collar was unbuttoned, exposing the thick white gauze pad still taped over the permanent claim mark on his neck. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path. Dean didn't need to look up. He felt the shift in air pressure. The bond, now firmly rooted in his nervous system, gave a low, contented thrum. "You skipped lunch," Victor said. The Alpha stepped into the humid enclosure. He had shed his suit jacket, wearing only a tailored black dress shirt, with a holster strapped over his broad chest. The sheer contrast of the deadly weapon against the lush, vibrant greenery was jarring. "I wasn't hungry," Dean replied, not stopping his rhythmic wiping of the leaves. "Maria makes portions meant for lumberjacks. I can only eat so much pasta before my stomach gives out." Victor walked closer, stopping on the opposite side of the potting bench. He reached out, his long fingers gently tracing the edge of a leaf Dean had just cleaned. "Maria worries about you. We all do. You have gained some weight back, but you're still too thin." Dean finally looked up. He met Victor's dark, intense gaze. The dynamic between them had shifted since the fever. The overt hostility was gone, replaced by a tense, heavy truce. Victor had backed off, giving Dean space, but the Alpha was always there, always watching, always emitting a low, steady frequency of protection that drove Dean's cynical mind insane. "I've survived this long on coffee and diner scraps," Dean said dryly. "A few missed meals won't kill me. Besides, I need to keep moving. If I sit in that giant bed all day, my muscles are going to atrophy." "Well," Victor's eyes dropped to the gauze on Dean's neck. A muscle feathered in his jaw. The unspoken rules of their arrangement were becoming suffocatingly clear. Dean was allowed to roam the estate, but never alone. He was allowed to wear his own clothes, but Victor's scent remained permanently anchored to his skin. He was free from rent, from double shifts, from the grinding poverty of his past, but he had traded it for a gilded cage. "Leo has a piano recital tomorrow evening," Victor said, smoothly changing the subject. "In the East Parlor, he requested your presence." Dean's hand stilled. A small, involuntary smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Over the past few weeks, the 6-year-old had become Dean's shadow. Leo didn't care about the complex, violent dynamics of the household. He just knew Dean was the man who stopped the loud noises, and therefore, Dean was entirely acceptable company for building blanket forts and watching cartoons. "I'll be there," Dean said. "I'll even wear a clean shirt." "You could wear a burlap sack and he would still be thrilled," Victor murmured. His voice dropped half an octave, scraping against Dean's eardrums like coarse velvet. "You are good with him." "I just listened to him," Dean shrugged, tossing the damp rag onto the bench. "Kids just want to be heard. Most of your guys look at him like he's made of glass or a ticking bomb." "He is the heir to the Carmine family," Victor said, the cold, pragmatic Mafia boss bleeding back into his tone. "To them, he is both." Dean studied the man in front of him. Victor was a walking contradiction, a ruthless killer who kept a manicured greenhouse, a Mafia don who patiently cut the crusts off his son's sandwiches, a monster who had violently claimed a stranger on the pavement, yet had spent 3 sleepless nights holding that same stranger through agonizing withdrawals. "And what am I to them?" Dean asked, the question slipping out before his defensive filters could catch it. Victor leaned forward, bracing his palms on the wooden bench. The distance between them vanished. The scent of cedar and smoke flared, wrapping around Dean like a heavy, protective blanket. "To them," Victor whispered, his eyes entirely black, "you are the untouchable center of my territory. You are the Omega who holds my leash, and they are terrified of you." Dean's breath hitched. He stared into Victor's eyes, seeing the raw, unapologetic truth in them. He wasn't a pet. He wasn't a hostage. In the twisted, violent hierarchy of this world, Victor had elevated Dean to the very top, anchoring him there with a bite that warned every predator to stay away. Dean swallowed hard, his pulse hammering against the gauze on his neck. He wanted to say something sarcastic. He wanted to push the alpha away, but his hand twitched, his fingers curling slightly toward Victor's arm. Before he could bridge the gap, the sharp, artificial chirp of a radio broke the heavy silence. Victor straightened up instantly, the possessive warmth evaporating into cold, tactical ice. He pulled a small radio from his belt. "Speak!" Victor barked. The voice on the other end was frantic, heavily filtered through static. "Boss, we got a breach at the south gate. 3 vehicles, heavily armed. It's the Moretti crew. Paulie just opened the perimeter for them." Dean's blood ran cold. The memory of the silver sedan, the deafening cracks of gunfire, the agonizing tear of metal through his chest, it all flooded back in a sickening wave. Victor's face went entirely blank. It was the terrifying stillness of a predator that had just identified its prey. "Lock down the main house," Victor ordered, his voice dead calm. "Get Leo into the vault, now." "Copy that. Moving the pup." Gunfire erupted over the radio. Not the papery pops of a drive-by, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of assault rifles. The radio went dead with a sharp hiss of static. Victor shoved the radio back onto his belt and drew his sidearm in one fluid, terrifyingly fast motion. He grabbed Dean by the bicep, his grip bruising. "Move," Victor commanded. The greenhouse, moments ago a humid sanctuary, instantly became a glass death trap. There was zero cover. Dean didn't argue. He ignored the protesting ache in his healing ribs and broke into a sprint alongside Victor, heading for the heavy steel door that connected the greenhouse to the west wing of the mansion. They burst into the hallway. The sheer chaos of the estate was deafening. Sirens wailed, a high-pitched, oscillating shriek that made Dean's newly sensitive ears ring. Men in dark suits were sprinting past them, chambering rounds into shotguns and rifles, shouting coordinates in frantic Italian. The smell of the house had changed. The rich scents of lemon polish and roasted garlic were entirely swallowed by the sharp metallic tang of adrenaline, sweat, and the acrid bite of gunpowder. "Where is Leo?" Dean shouted over the siren, grabbing Victor's shoulder. "The east parlor," Victor said, his eyes scanning the corridor. They were moving him to the vault beneath the library. A massive explosion shook the foundation of the house. Dust rained down from the plaster ceiling. The chandeliers flickered and died, plunging the hallway into the dim gray light of the emergency backups. "The library is on the other side of the courtyard," Dean realized, his heart hammering against his sternum. "If Paulie let them in the south gate, they'll cut right through the east wing." Victor cursed violently, a harsh, guttural sound. "Stay behind me." They moved through the sprawling mansion with terrifying speed. Victor was a ghost, a lethal shadow gliding through the corridors with his weapon raised. Dean followed, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The adrenaline was masking the pain in his ribs, but he knew he was a liability. He had no weapon. He had no training. They reached the grand foyer. The massive oak front doors had been blown off their hinges, splintered wood scattered across the marble floor. 3 bodies lay in the center of the room. 2 were Victor's men. The third was a stranger wearing a tactical vest. Victor didn't pause. He stepped over the bodies, his eyes locked on the arched doorway leading to the east wing. Suddenly, a heavy, suffocating scent flooded the foyer. It smelled like rancid pepper and sour sweat. Paulie stepped out from behind a marble pillar on the mezzanine above them. The heavily scarred Alpha held a submachine gun, a manic, desperate look in his eyes. "Nothing personal, boss," Paulie yelled, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Moretti offered me 3 shipping yards and a seat at the table. You went soft, claiming street rats, letting the kid run around making crayon drawings instead of learning the business." Victor didn't negotiate. He didn't monologue. He raised his weapon and fired twice in a fraction of a second. The bullet sparked against the marble pillar as Paulie ducked back into cover, wildly returning fire. "Get down!" Victor roared, shoving Dean hard behind a heavy mahogany credenza. Wood splintered above Dean's head as bullets chewed through the antique furniture. The noise was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against his eardrums. He curled into a tight ball, his hands covering his ears, his body shaking uncontrollably. The panic was entirely biological, an Omega trapped in a crossfire between dominant, aggressive alphas. But beneath the panic, the bond in his neck flared white-hot. It wasn't demanding submission this time. It was transmitting Victor's absolute unyielding rage, and beneath that rage was a thread of stark, paralyzing fear. Leo. Dean forced his eyes open. He looked past the edge of the credenza. Through the arched doorway of the east wing, he saw a flash of a green dinosaur backpack. Leo was huddled under a heavy oak side table in the adjoining corridor, his hands over his ears, his face buried in his knees. His bodyguard was on the floor a few feet away, a pool of dark blood expanding rapidly across the Persian rug. Down the hall, 2 of Moretti's men were advancing, checking rooms. They were less than 30 feet from the boy. Victor was pinned down by Paulie's suppressing fire from the mezzanine. He couldn't see his son. Dean's brain calculated the geometry of the violence, just like it had on that wet Tuesday outside the bakery. The sheer, stupid, raw instinct took over. He was cynical. Yes. He was tired. Yes. But he was deeply, profoundly protective of the things he claimed. And in the past 6 weeks, somewhere between the crayon drawings and the terrible jokes, the kid had become his. Dean didn't scream this time. He didn't hesitate. He scrambled on his hands and knees, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, and launched himself across the open gap of the foyer doorway into the east corridor. A bullet grazed his calf, a sharp, burning sting, but the adrenaline pushed it away. He slid across the polished hardwood floor, crashing directly into the side table where Leo was hiding. "Dean!" Leo sobbed, throwing his small arms around Dean's neck. The boy was trembling violently, his scent sour with absolute terror. "I got you, kid. I got you," Dean rasped, wrapping his body around the boy, tucking him tightly against his chest. Footsteps approached, heavy boots on hardwood. Dean looked around frantically. There was no exit. The vault was at the end of the hall, but they would never make it. His eyes locked onto the fallen bodyguard. A heavy black Sig Sauer pistol lay on the rug, 3 feet away. Dean had never fired a gun in his life. He despised them. They were loud, dirty, and destroyed everything they touched. The 2 Moretti men stepped into the corridor. They saw Dean huddled under the table with the boy. One of them raised his rifle. Dean lunged. He grabbed the heavy pistol from the rug. It weighed 10 times more than he expected. He didn't aim down the sights. He didn't check his stance. He just pointed the heavy steel barrel directly at the center of mass of the leading man and pulled the trigger. The recoil was brutal. It snapped his wrist back and sent a shockwave of agony straight through his healing scapula. He screamed as the titanium screws in his shoulder ground together. But the gun fired. The leading man staggered backward, a red bloom erupting on his tactical vest. He collapsed against the wall. The second man cursed, swinging his rifle toward Dean. Before he could pull the trigger, the entire corridor seemed to compress. The air pressure dropped so violently Dean's ears popped. The scent of dark cedar and ozone hit the hallway like a freight train. Victor stepped into the corridor. He didn't look like a man anymore. He looked like an apex predator that had entirely slipped its leash. He moved with terrifying fluid violence. He didn't even use his gun. Victor closed the distance in 2 massive strides, grabbed the barrel of the man's rifle, forcing it upward as it discharged into the ceiling, and drove his knee into the man's chest with a sickening crunch. The man crumpled. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the distant wail of sirens and the ragged sound of Dean's own breathing. Victor stood over the bodies, his chest heaving. His white shirt was splattered with crimson. He slowly turned around. His dark, entirely dilated eyes locked onto Dean. Dean was still on the floor, shaking violently, his uninjured arm wrapped protectively over Leo's head, the heavy pistol gripped loosely in his other hand. Blood was trickling down Dean's leg from the graze on his calf. Victor dropped his weapon. He fell to his knees in front of them. His massive hands reached out, trembling slightly as they cupped Dean's face, ignoring the dirt and the blood. "You're hit," Victor breathed, his voice raw, stripped entirely of its smooth authority. He pulled Dean and Leo both into his chest, burying his face into the junction of Dean's neck, right over the bite mark. "I'm fine," Dean choked out, dropping the gun. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. He wrapped his arms around Victor's broad back, clutching the expensive fabric of his shirt. He was crying. He hadn't realized it until he tasted the salt on his lips. "I'm fine. The kid is fine." Victor's grip tightened, a desperate, crushing embrace. "You stupid, stubborn Omega," the Alpha whispered, his voice shaking. "You jumped in front of a gun for him again." "He's mine, too," Dean sobbed, the truth finally breaking through the heavy armor of his cynicism. He squeezed Leo tighter. He pressed his face into Victor's shoulder, inhaling the rich, smoky scent of his Alpha. "You're both mine." The medical wing was a place of sterile nightmares, but this time the lighting was dim and the room was quiet. Dean sat on the edge of the pristine white bed. His calf was neatly bandaged. His shoulder throbbed with a vengeance, but the doctor assured him the hardware held. He was exhausted down to the marrow of his bones. The estate was secure. The Moretti crew had been wiped out. Paulie was dead, dealt with personally by Victor in the foyer. The blood had been scrubbed from the marble, but the heavy dark reality of their lives lingered in the air. Victor stood by the window, staring out at the dark estate. He had finally changed out of his ruined clothes, wearing a simple black t-shirt and gray sweatpants. He looked entirely drained. The ruthless Mafia Don was gone, leaving only a deeply tired, terrified father. "I'm sending you away," Victor said quietly to the glass. Dean froze. The words felt like physical blows. He gripped the edge of the mattress, his knuckles turning white. "What?" Victor slowly turned around. His eyes were hollow, filled with a deep, profound self-loathing. "I claimed you because I was selfish. I saw a man brave enough to die for a child he didn't know, and my biology demanded I keep you. I told myself I was saving your life." Victor crossed the room, stopping a few feet from the bed. He didn't reach out. He kept his hands carefully at his sides. "But all I did was drag you into a war zone," Victor continued, his voice thick with regret. "You have taken bullets twice in 2 months because of my world. My enemies will never stop coming for me, and now they know you are my weakness. I will not watch you bleed out on my floor because of my pride." Dean stared at him. The bond inside his chest felt tight, constricting his lungs. He felt a sudden, terrifying panic. "I've contacted a specialist," Victor said, looking down at the floor. "He can sever the bond, medically. It will be painful, but you will survive. I've set up an account in your name. Enough money to buy a house anywhere in the world. A new identity. You will never have to scrub a griddle or worry about rent again. You will be safe. You will be free." A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the room. Free. It was the word Dean had craved his entire adult life. He could walk away. He could leave the guns, the blood, the mafia politics, and the terrifying, consuming gravity of this Alpha behind. He could finally be safe. Dean looked at his hands. They were scarred from grease burns, calloused from years of grinding poverty. He remembered the damp, freezing apartment. He remembered the crushing loneliness of knowing that if he died in his sleep, no one would notice for weeks. Safety was an illusion. He had been safe before the bakery shooting, and it had tasted like ash. Dean looked up at Victor. The Alpha was waiting for the answer, his broad shoulders braced as if preparing for a firing squad. "Severing the bond," Dean started, his voice quiet but incredibly steady. "It would make me sick, probably put me back in withdrawals. Victor flinched slightly. Yes, but it is temporary. And Leo? Dean asked. What do I tell him? That the superhero who saves him from loud noises got tired and moved to Florida? Victor swallowed hard. He will adapt. He is strong. He shouldn't have to be, Dean snapped, the sudden anger flaring hot in his chest. Dean stood up. His leg ached and his shoulder screamed, but he ignored it. He closed the distance between them, stopping inches from Victor's chest. He had to tilt his head back to look the Alpha in the eye. You think you're being noble? Dean said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that made Victor's eyes widen slightly. You think you're giving me a choice? But you're just being a coward. Victor's brow furrowed. Dean! Shut up, Dean interrupted. The sheer audacity of an Omega silencing a Mafia Don made the air in the room crackle. You claimed me when I was dying on the pavement. You forced your venom into my blood. You made me yours when I had no say in it. Dean reached up, his fingers wrapping around the collar of Victor's t-shirt. He pulled, forcing the massive Alpha to bend slightly toward him. But I am making the choice now, Dean whispered fiercely. I'm not leaving. I don't want a quiet house in the suburbs. I don't want an empty life where no one gives a damn if I exist. I want the kid with the dinosaur backpack. And God help me, I want the monster standing in front of me. Victor's breath hitched. His dark eyes flared, the pupils blowing wide, swallowing the iris entirely. The scent of cedar spiked, thick and possessive, mixing violently with the sudden sweet rush of Dean's blackberry scent. Dean, Victor warned, his voice a low, vibrating growl. If you stay, I will never let you go. There is no second chance at this. You will be bound to this life. To me. Forever. I know, Dean said. The cynical, exhausted survivor inside him finally quieted, replaced by something grounded, fierce, and entirely unshakable. He didn't wait for Victor to make the move. Dean tilted his head to the side, exposing the thick gauze pad covering his scent gland. With his free hand, he ripped the tape away. The original bite mark was healed into a jagged, permanent scar, flush with the heat of his racing pulse. Do it again, Dean commanded, his voice raw with need. Claim me while I'm looking at you, while I'm asking for it. Victor didn't need to be told twice. The Alpha let out a heavy guttural sound, wrapping his arms around Dean's waist and pulling him flush against his chest. Victor buried his face into the crook of Dean's neck. He didn't bite immediately. He pressed open-mouth kisses against the scar tissue, inhaling deeply, entirely intoxicated by the willing submission of his fiercely stubborn Omega. Then, Victor's teeth grazed the skin. Mine, Victor breathed against his throat. Yours, Dean confirmed, tangling his fingers into Victor's dark hair. Victor sank his teeth in. It didn't feel like violence this time. It felt like an anchor dropping into the deepest, darkest part of the ocean, finally hitting solid ground. The pain was a sharp, brilliant flash that quickly melted into a heavy, narcotic warmth. The fresh venom flooded Dean's veins, but his body didn't reject it. It welcomed it. The bond snapped into place, permanent, unbreakable, and entirely consensual. Dean sagged against the Alpha, his eyes fluttering shut. He was exhausted. He was covered in bruises, his leg was bleeding, and his shoulder was held together by metal. He was tied to a world of violence, blood, and unforgiving rules. But as Victor held him tightly, the scent of smoke and cedar wrapping around him like an impenetrable shield, Dean breathed in the quiet hum of the estate. For the first time in his thoroughly miserable life, he was exactly where he belonged. Dean's journey from a cynical, street-worn Omega to the fiercely protective core of the Carmine family wasn't born from a fairy tale. It was forged in blood, gunpowder, and raw survival. He and Victor didn't start with love. They started with a brutal, life-saving claim that forced two stubborn survivors to understand what it truly means to belong to someone. If this gritty, intense Mafia Omegaverse story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share it with a friend who loves dark, slow burn romance. And don't forget to subscribe for more raw, unapologetic stories.